Is that Barry Gilder that I see?
That's him.
Hello, Your Excellency. Hello, Your Excellency.
He can only wave. Oh, he can unmute.
Hey?
Hi, Barry. How are you?
Já busy.
Bye.
Okay, Zenzo, you may begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Sipogazi. Let me take this opportunity to welcome everyone who has taken time to attend this important launch of a report that has taken almost 2 years to put together. As we know, webinars in themselves have been proliferating like the virus, the coronavirus, they are everywhere. So we do not take lightly your time that you have taken to be part of this launch today. So my name is Dr. Zenzo Moyo and I'm a researcher at MISTRA. I am going to be chairing this session and then we have several speakers that I'm going to introduce a bit later. But for now, let me quickly go through the house rules that we have here so that we can have a smooth and a proper seminar. So the first rule says we must mute our microphone all the times during this webinar and also switch off your video camera for improved sound and connectivity. Only the speakers on the program may switch on their video camera. Please use the chat function for questions, comments, and for clarity. Do not distract the speakers on the floor with unmuted mics and interruptions during the presentations. Please also note that this discussion is going to be recorded for distribution later on to our networks and social media. Please also reach out to us via our email if you have not received a copy of the report. Sipogazi has emailed the report to everyone who RSVP'd, but in case you have not received it, please just reach out to us via email and then we will be able to send it to you. The program as well for this event has also been uploaded in the chat function, so you can open and access it there if you want to, if you've forgotten the names of the people that are going to be speaking. Yes, so probably let me begin by giving a short background information about this report. Understanding South Africa's post-colonial democratic trajectory, a comparative analysis of post-colonial societies, is a study that the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, that's MISTRA, and Open Society Foundation South Africa did in partnership. And the objective of this project was to empirically examine whether South Africa's current democratic trajectory is an exceptional one or it's comparable to other post-colonial experiences, other countries. And as you can hear from the objective, in order for us to be able to address this objective, we had to identify some countries that went through a liberation struggle, just like South Africa, and the countries that we identified are Mozambique, Algeria, and India. And then we considered several issues and themes amongst these countries in order to make a determination of whether South Africa's democratic trajectory is exceptional or it's similar to the other countries. We also discuss in this report the corresponding implications and what it means for South Africa. Because if you look at the countries that we selected, these countries attained their independence quite some time back, and therefore South Africa has can learn negative and positive lessons from these particular countries. And probably maybe just to also give a bit of how we conceptualized the program and the project. So the framework that we utilized uses two lenses to conceptualize and understand democracy. Firstly, the study looks at transitional democracy and argues that the principles of this form of democracy are inadequate to measure democracy's utility in a developmental context, and therefore advocates for a consolidated form of democracy. And this consolidated form, Achimafetch writes about it and termed it popular democracy. So it's that kind of democracy. Some people call it thick, others call it very strong democracy. But it's that kind of democracy that goes beyond just transitional democracy. Transitional democracy, which really concerns itself mainly on liberal and procedural issues, such as having free, fair elections, regular elections, political pluralisms. So when we're talking about democratic consolidation, we're talking about that deep democracy that focuses on existential conditions of the most marginalized in any particular society. And we also look at how these their lives can be ameliorated and made better. And some scholars recognize that democratic consolidation is the defining feature of any democratic experience. And it is on that basis that it can only be called a national democracy, because at that point, it kind of encompasses and includes everyone in the country, both those, the elite, as well as the poor and the underprivileged. Right. I also have a reference here from Achima Fetcher again, who once argued that while liberal democracy upholds principles of equality of all citizens before the law, it fails spectacularly to address questions of social equality and justice. And in order to ameliorate this weakness that transitional or liberal democracy has, Mafetcher suggested a reconsideration of democratic practice in developing countries, such as those in Africa, and one can argue also in all the countries in the South, with the aim of orienting and its dominant liberal leanings towards the material needs of all those that are governed. And so we are looking at a democracy that kind of advances popular livelihoods. It also advances popular participation. The people that are governed are given platforms where they can be able to participate. It also affords popular power. So in other words, what it says is that all those that are governed or those that are governing at least must have the consent of the people that they are governing, and they must be legitimate leaders. So that's the kind of measure that we thought is very important when we're analyzing this democratic trajectory in post-colonial societies. And then in order to achieve this, we used several themes. So if you go into the report and try and read the report, you'll see that almost in the case studies, in all the case studies, as well as in the main part of the report that deals with South Africa, you would find that there are themes that arrange this report. For instance, we talk about the state and its institutions. We talk about the Liberation Party in power and its future. We also talk about separation of powers. We talk about civil liberties and civil society. We then also go on to talk about the socio-economic question as a fulfillment of a consolidated democracy, because we note that formal political rights by themselves are virtually meaningless if not accompanied by progressive realization of social justice. And then we also engage and highlight the possibility of that democracy deconsolidating and what conditions should be avoided in order to avoid the democratic deconsolidation. So let me take this opportunity first, before I proceed any further, to bring into this discussion the Bulelwa Ngewana, who is the executive director of OSF South Africa, who is our partners in this project. I'll simply read quickly her short bio before I allow her to speak. She is going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, where she will expand in terms of this program, because this project is part of a bigger project within OSF. So she's going to tell us maybe more about what OSF does and the bigger project on which this one is part of. So Bulelwa Ngewana is the Executive Director of Open Society Foundation of South Africa. Bulelwa has extensive experience in community engagement along with a passion for social justice. Her experience includes leadership positions at the Betha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the Philippe Strategy Project, and the Cape Town Partnership, a public-private organization set up to ensure that Cape Town is an inclusive, vibrant, and sustainable central city that reflects a common identity for all its people. Bulelwa holds a master's degree in town and regional planning from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Bulelwa, over to you.
Thanks, Zenzo, and welcome to everyone. As Zenzo has said already, I'm sure you probably have attended many Zoom sessions this week. So we really appreciate your presence here. I'm going to be very short, but I would like just to say I believe the MISTRA report is a great diagnostic tool for the state of South Africa's democracy. It has been very useful to OSF-SA understanding of the underpinnings of South African society and has helped us shape our thinking and define our strategy for the next 4 years. Some of you might already know that we have been busy with a 4-year strategy just before COVID. And this report formed the basis of our thinking. And of course, with COVID, a lot of the issues that are raised in the report became even more prominent in terms of, and clear in terms of the urgency that is needed to address them. The report underscores our belief in the importance of fact-based evidence and research. Our strategy is really based on facts, and we're trying to be as pragmatic as possible in our methodology for implementing it. An Afro-Barometer report released earlier this year spoke about South Africa as being in a democratic recession, which tied in with the MISTRA report's idea of South Africa at risk of democratic consolidation. I'm sure the speakers today will be able to really give you a very meaty understanding of what that democratic deconsolidation looks like. OSF-SA, of course, is committed to protecting the pillars of South Africa's democracy. So the idea of a democracy in peril really struck a chord with us, and we felt that this is an important issue to address. Many of the issues examined and unearthed in the report are particularly relevant, not only to OSF-SA, but to all who live in South Africa and indeed in the continent, and all who've watched many democracies within the continent not being as successful as they could be, and in a way betraying their own people in the process. This includes the impact of state capture, the extent of the private sector corruption, an examination of sexual and gender-based violence, and recommendations to counter this scourge. The report highlighting of a need for the establishment of a political culture resonated very strongly with our thinking about political education to ensure an active citizenry engaged with the democratic process, especially youth, young people, who have not had the benefit of being mentored in terms of activism, but are actually burning with and passionate about getting their voices heard. We're really quite interested in that sector. I was, of course, quite disturbed when I read this earlier this year, how young people in South Africa are not interested in voting, and that the general election of 2019 achieved the lowest voter turnout since the first democratic elections of 1994. For those of us who queued and to cast our vote then, or fought long, hard for the right to do so, this is not only unfathomable, it is unconscionable, and we need to do something about it. If you are a mother like me and you have children of voting age, you will understand the dinner table conversations that you have with them about the importance of voting, even if they really have no trust in the political system, or they feel that the political system is a waste of time. We do need to really inject and be able to activate our young people to understand the importance of voting. It doesn't help that they only hear about voting when it's time for elections, and they don't hear about the democratic culture that's necessary to support that vote every 4 years when it does come around. One way of the ways that we intend to address this issue as OSF is by supporting civic and political education, but do appreciate the disconnect young people face when the rights that are enshrined in our constitution remain largely unrealized to so many of them. And they've been left let down even by systems that were supposed to really brighten their future, such as education. So how many of you know so many graduates, many PhDs for that matter, who are unemployed at the moment because they can't secure employment on the basis of their education? So it's kind of like a dream that has been kind of robbed of oxygen in a way for it to bloom, to become the dream of one's ability to pull themselves up out of poverty. Everybody knows that education is supposed to be that base. This reports, the MISTRA reports highlights offensive narratives around nationalism and xenophobia, which continue to play out in certain spheres of the mainstream media and on social media. The key takeout for me was how on South Africa's democratization, one cannot take place within the context of rigid racial identities and national rabble rousing. The linked point of how material improvement can protect society from both malignant external and internal forces that can scupper efforts of racial reconciliation and national reconstruction is another way our strategy seeks to address through support to organizations working to protect, advance, and realize socioeconomic rights. At some stage, we will be able to call you all again, just to present to you the next 4 years, the OSF strategy for the next 4 years, so that the dialogue continues. This is just one part of that journey. Of course, the landscape against which the report was written is vastly different to today's reality. Who could have imagined COVID-19 as a ruinous and its ruinous impact and a major disruptor of life as we know it? We saw how approximately 3 million people to 2 million of them women lost their job as a direct result of COVID. We know that many of them were employed in the informal sector. This week is Africa Week, and we've been debating the effects of COVID on philanthropy, especially throughout the continent. And it's been quite interesting to have this conversation in the middle of Africa Week, because it's really quite relevant. I'm almost finished then, so I don't know if my time is still okay. What worries me is what effect extreme poverty will have on issues of xenophobia, as highlighted in the MISTRA report. Even before the COVID crisis, the report concluded that most of the victims of xenophobia in South Africa are people of African origin, mostly located in working class spaces. Colleagues, I hope this is going to be a session that you will enjoy. It is clear that South Africa is facing a myriad of challenges. It is up to us to co-create solutions to these social and economic problems and overarching problems of democratic deconsolidation in our country. It is also very important to understand that one of the opportunities that COVID has given us is the opportunity to collaborate across sector and within sectors. And so for us as OSF, we're embracing that, hearing as many voices as you can as we construct our strategy. I'm going to end here, Zenzo, and hand back over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Bulelwa. Thank you so much. Need I emphasize that one of our objectives is to engender through this report a societal discussion where people engage on issues. If you guys, everyone who is here, can take time to read through the report, review the report, give us feedback, let the report grow legs so that some more other papers can emerge from it. But before I move on to our other speakers, I just want to quickly capture a few takeaways from the country case studies that we did. That's India, Mozambique, and Algeria. And these are issues that were kind of very poignant for me, especially when I'm looking at the democratic dispensation that is currently prevailing in South Africa. Like when I talk about India, India has been independent for 73 years, having gained its independence in 1947. And it was the Indian National Congress, the Nationalist Party, that led the country to independence. So this part of liberation is no longer in power after being dislodged by Modi's BJP party in 2014. But before that, and this is very important to mention, before that, before the National the India National Congress was dislodged, India went through various several coalition governments, both at national level and at state level. And I mention this particularly because of the instability that coalition governments bring, and the recent, the 2016 municipal elections in South Africa would attest to that. If you look at Tshwane, you look at Johannesburg, and you look at PE, Nelson Mandela Municipality, you realize the instability that was there. And that those are results of coalition governments. And it is very important that these things are discussed and understood, and their effects also exposed. Now India is in the hands of this BJP party, which is a right-wing party oriented towards Hindu nationalism and fundamentalism, which compromises the existence of other religions. And that's what happens when a nationalist party that is supposed to be strategic in the development of a country becomes what became of the ink in India. And then in Mozambique, Mozambique gained its independence in 1975. So that was June in 1975. And 2020 marks what, 45 years of Frelimo in power. And Frelimo is not entirely hegemonic, or when they ascended to power, they were not entirely hegemonic, and they went on to institute a one-party state. But immediately after that, it was plunged into a civil war that lasted for over 15 years. And we can imagine the amount of damage that that civil war caused at a moment when the country was supposed to be transiting towards democracy. And then we can also imagine how much effect that will have in Mozambique's endeavor to institute a consolidated form of democracy. Of course, post the signing of the GPA in 1992, we see quite a steady increase in the GDP of the country. I mean, for about up to 2015, the GDP growth was high, between 7 and 10%, but it has started to decline. And there are several reasons for that, and corruption is part of it. Weak state institutions are also part of that decline. And these are issues that other countries should guard against, and especially South Africa. And then one of the takeaways that I have from Algeria is that Algeria gained its independence in 1962 after about 10 years of a liberation struggle. And today it's, 50 years old post-independence. And what is notable about Algeria, and I'm sure Albie Sachs will talk about this, is that its democracy, or its post-liberation society, is defined almost like a deep state. I've heard the use of that term. So a deep state is a group of unelected people, typically influential members of the military, who are involved in the secret manipulation or control of government policies. In other words, this group becomes a super government, a system that is accountable to no one except itself. And so the Algerian People's National Army occupies an overarching role in the Algerian politics. Almost all of Algeria's presidents, you start from Ben Bella, the first president, up to the present one, it's either they were military members of the military, or they are very close to military to the military. But there's an interesting dynamic, though, and I don't know if the speakers are going to be able to also speak about this, the entanglement of the military vis-a-vis the ability of the government that is informed by the military to provide services and some of the material conditions of the people within the country. I hope we might be able to get there, but the report also touches on this. So if we look at the GDP per capita in Algeria, in 1999, it was 1,600. In 2018, it was 4,080. And it speaks to the ability, or at least the attempt by the government of Algeria to use proceeds from the natural resources that Algeria is endowed with. That's gas, that's oil, to also make sure that some of these resources reach the people on the ground. Let me not take too much time and bring in the other speakers. I will quickly introduce the first speaker who's going to speak, the main speaker, Joel, whom I'm going to give about 25 to 30 minutes to speak. What I'm going to do, Joel, is that when you are left up with about 5 minutes, I will show my not so cute face so that you can then see that you need to wrap up. Now, quickly, I will introduce Joel by reading his short bio. So Joel Nyachichenze is the Executive Director of MISTRA. He has a Master of Science degree in Financial Economics and a postgraduate diploma in Economic Principles from the University of London and a diploma in Political Science from the Institute of Social Sciences in Moscow. He is a visiting professor at the Vet School of Governance. He is a member of the boards of the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR, NetBank Group, and the Life Healthcare Group. He is a member of the ANC National Executive Committee and is also served as a member of the National Planning Commission from 2010 to 2015. So this is the team that produced the current NDP that we have. Now, before joining the Government Communication and Information System as CEO in 1998, Ms. Nyachichenze was head of communication in President Nelson Mandela's office. In addition to being the GCIS CEO, he was appointed head of policy coordination and advisory services in the presidency in 2001. So he headed this policy sector on a full-time basis from 2006 up until his retirement in 2009. But again, he was also part of the liberation movement. Before 1994, he served in various capacities within the ANC, Radio Freedom, Maibuye, editor and member of the ANC Politico-Military Council and deputy head of the Department of Information and Publicity, and was also part of the ANC negotiating team. Joel, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zenzo, for the introduction. And perhaps I should also thank you for the summary that you have intimated regarding what is contained in the report, because that makes my work much easier. Although I'll go over some of the issues that you have raised. I should start off by thanking everyone, particularly OSF South Africa, for affording us the opportunity to undertake this project, and express special appreciation to Judge Albisaks for agreeing to lend his stature and wisdom to our engagement today. I think amongst us are also the other contributors to the book. And I do hope they will help in clarifying some of the issues. So why did MISTRA readily agree to undertake this study? It's because, firstly, to examine how South Africa's democratic trajectory compares to other post-colonial experiences is pertinent to how we should chart our own future. Secondly, the project affords us the opportunity to debate the very meaning of democracy, as Zenzo has already hinted. Thirdly, and related to this, is the question of post-colonial class formation and its implications for democratic consolidation or deconsolidation. Zenzo has already explained why we chose these specific case studies. Firstly, because all of them went through protracted liberation struggles, and variously, they reflect different levels of development, but interestingly also evince, I think, a unique path dependency which is informed by colonial traditions, the Portuguese, the French, and the British. Further, all these countries have the liberation movement either as being still electorally dominant, or in the case of India, had been mostly unassailable before its current decimation. And that factor is important for South Africa, that nothing lasts forever. What then is the methodology that was used, and what is the conceptual underpinning to the study? Zenzo has already hinted at this. We did desktop research, we did interviews, and we looked at the anti-colonial struggles, the political transitions, formal institutions and systems, civil society, as well as socio-economic dynamics. And we said to ourselves, to understand the processes of consolidation or deconsolidation, we naturally will have to answer the question, what actually is democracy? As we know, the concept and praxis of democracy has evolved over the ages. And I think Farah becomes relevant in this regard in describing the Greek and Athenian city-states, to say politics during that era was an attempt to enable men of different classes and attributes to become capable citizens, to express and transform their understanding of the good through political interaction. Of course, needless to say, as with virtually all societies, politics historically had been patriarchal. The concept of liberal democracy places primacy on formal political liberties, free and fair elections, separation of powers, and a variety of political freedoms. And this notion, unfortunately, underplays the inherent link between political and socio-economic rights. In that context, Amartya Sen is quite relevant in this discourse. He argues that the exercise of political agency is influenced by socio-economic conditions like poverty, which he describes as sources of unfreedom. So the approach in this book is inspired by Sen, and it's also inspired by Mafeje, who argues that democratic consolidation should revolve around three fundamental elements: popular livelihoods, popular participation, and popular power. Inversely, democracy potentially can regress over time if it does not fulfill the material needs of the people. Such regression would make elections less competitive without necessarily undermining the electoral mechanism in its entirety. It would restrict participation without explicitly abolishing the norms of universal franchise, and it would reduce accountability, all insidiously leading to democratic consolidation. I would submit that what we are seeing in some of the developed countries, including the US currently, do reflect elements of these tendencies. Let us now examine the three case studies. And because Zenzo has gone through this, I'll be quite quick. Mozambique attained independence through a struggle in which the military element was central. It went through that failed experiment with a socialist-oriented path of development. The reasons for the failure of that path of development, I think, require a separate discussion on their own. But I think the point needs to be made that the Renamo military insurgency, which undermined the country's peaceful evolution, was, yes, orchestrated from the outside, but its sustenance within Mozambique was partly based on grievances around uneven spatial development and a poor handling of the national question. With regard to multi-party democracy since the 1990s, even though Frelimo has won majorities over the years, voter turnout has been on the decrease from 88% in 1994 to about 50% today. Civil society organizations have emerged, but many of them face pressure from the state. And Mozambique's challenges in creating a united nation is reflected in the geographic patterns of electoral preferences. And so Frelimo is dominant as a governing party, but it's far from being hegemonic. The country still has to master the practice of separation of powers and consistent respect for many human rights, such as media freedom. What about proxies of popular livelihoods? Yes, Mozambique experienced high rates of economic growth for about 2 decades and more, but it has not advanced much. For instance, that is on socio-economic issues, 94% of young girls in Mozambique enroll for primary education, but more than half drop out in the 5th grade. Close to 1/3 of the population suffers from malnutrition, including 43% of children under 5. So we can look at many indicators, and there is that deficit in Mozambique's democracy. Many argue that Frelimo politicians are implicated in what some have termed elite capitalism, characterized by an embedded patronage system and corruption. As such, you have in Mozambique many of the trappings of formal democracy with some weaknesses, but in the broad sense, the country seems to be marking time in terms of democratic consolidation. Let me conclude this Mozambican case study with a sweeping generalization about the current insurgency in Cabo Delgado province. Reference to ISIS and so-called Islamic terrorism may partly describe this development, but in my view, the spatial dimension of economic marginalization is pertinent to understanding this insurgency, as is the failure to manage ethnic and religious issues and to build local social compacts. So I would argue Mozambique is facing not so much a military threat as distinct from exploitation of local grievances by bandits, which is of course aggravated by how the army and police have responded to the situation. So the solution to the Cabo Delgado problem cannot therefore be solely military or even military in its essence. What about Algeria? Zenzo has indicated that although it was a liberation movement which combined strands of nationalism, socialism, and Islam, and was organized in executive and legislative units, the military wing, the National Liberation Army, gained ascendancy and became very dominant. After decades of dominance of the Liberation Front, Algeria opened up the political space, and in 1991, the Islamic Salvation Front won the first round of parliamentary elections, which were annulled, and the army prevented any negotiations and carried out a campaign of mass repression. Elections have taken place there regularly since 1997, but there's been minimal democratic consolidation. When the army became unhappy with the Liberation Front, it instigated the formation of an alternative party, which won parliamentary elections in 1997. And as Zenzo indicated, the government was able to use national endowments to build infrastructure, buy off sections of the population, and broadly improve the standard of living. After years of factional conflicts within the party and within the army, and with poor revenue from hydrocarbons, the population has since last year, 2019, embarked on widespread protests. These protests are different from previous ones in that they are centered around democratic reforms and have got the potential to reshape the country's political landscape. What is also interesting is that currently the country's judiciary and electoral commission have revolted against the regime. They are unwilling to oversee contrived elections. To conclude on Algeria, one can make the observation that unlike in Sudan, the protesters do not have a leadership core to negotiate with the regime, and so the protests are susceptible to divide and rule. And one can draw a parallel here with Egypt, where a protest movement was unable to transform itself into an electoral force, thus leading to the defeat of what one can call a revolution. And so in Algeria, you are dealing with a democracy that is constrained, characterized by dominance of the military, and bottled up anger has resulted in mass revolt and a kind of stalemate between civil society and the military dominated regime. What about India? Since 1997, as Zenzo has indicated, India has been a liberal democracy in terms of formal political institutions, separation of powers, regular elections, and so on. And these have functioned relatively well, except for the brief period of the state of emergency in the mid-1970s. Over the years, from a dominant party of liberation, the secular liberal Indian Congress Party, then a two-party system and coalition governments and so on. There's something that is interesting and relevant to South Africa, and that is the splintering of politics with minor regional entities drawing upon local fault lines of money, social power, and influence. And for every election, there's been an indication from media reports of an increase in the number of legislators who have criminal records. As a consequence, the bureaucracy has been under undue pressure to conform to the dictates of politicians, but it has resisted this, and so has the judiciary. What is also impressive with India, I think it's the existence and activism of civil society on issues of social justice, issues of gender rights, issues of national unity and secularism. For 50 years, India experimented with a mixed economy, but it has not fared very well with regard to socio-economic indicators. It has also experienced high rates of growth in the past 2 decades or so, but it has the highest rates of child malnutrition in the world, differential access to education, and what one can refer to as pre-modern hierarchical relations based on caste and religion. In my view, a fundamental challenge in India with the decline of the Congress Party is how to forge a secular state rather than one in which right-wing religiosity holds sway. This is a problem that Indian democracy has wrestled with historically, and the tragedy today is that establishment politics has veered towards populist identity politics premised largely on religion. Now, to move towards the end, how do these experiences of these case studies compare with South Africa's democratic transformation? As we know, led by the ANC, the South African Liberation Movement envisaged a new dispensation in which political liberation is accompanied by socio-economic rights, which should be progressively attained. In addition to separation of powers, and thus a counterbalance among the 3 arms of government, the South African Constitution also provides for bodies entrusted with the protection and promotion of democracy, such as the Gender Commission and Public Protector. And using the experience of the Public Protector's Office as a mini case study, the authors argue that these bodies must both rely on and cooperate with the executive and the legislatures, and also stay at arm's length from them. They need to retain the goodwill of those with power and resources, but at the same time be willing, when objective circumstances so demand, to take a highly adversarial stance towards them. As such, how these bodies and the judiciary negotiate that terrain has been and will remain critical in the evolution of South African democracy. With regard to social justice, I'm quite certain that we are familiar with the facts that much has been done in trying to lend material meaning to political freedom. The state has tried to act as an instrument of redistribution with a progressive taxation system and a social wage, which is amongst the best, I think, in developing countries, both in terms of actual income, the social grants, and social services. However, the impact of these efforts on the structure of the economy and the patterns of income distribution and asset ownership has been limited. One can give many examples. I'll just use the upper bound poverty line. It was about 55% in 2015. Amongst Black Africans, it was 64%, higher than the average. Amongst whites, 1%. If we look at unemployment, in 2020, it was about, at the beginning, before COVID, 30% in the general population and 9.3% amongst whites. What does this communicate? While a Black elite has grown, in part benefiting from economic empowerment, And while access to education has massively improved, the reproduction of colonial capitalist relations seems to be persistent. What about civil society and the state? I think South Africa has got quite an active and independent civil society. It uses mass protests and also judicial activism to good effect in order to enforce accountability and broaden civil and socio-economic rights. The governing party describes the kind of society it seeks to build as one combining the best attributes of a developmental state, such as experienced in Southeast Asia, and social democracy in the manner of Nordic societies. So in terms of democratic consolidation, it can be argued that the South African polity has got all the major characteristics of liberal democracy. At the same time, progress has been patchy insofar as socio-economic transformation or social justice is concerned. The socio-economic weaknesses are in part a consequence of poor state capacity, but also the global macroeconomic environment in which South Africa's democracy emerged. Why did corruption and state capture become embedded? Very briefly, I would say the first factor is the type of state that was inherited in 1994, which was corrupt to the core. Secondly, the exercise of power in a complex democracy, or rather complex bureaucracy, encourages citizens to try and find ways of circumventing the rules. Thirdly, is the factor that relates to the complex process of post-colonial class formation, the necessary emergence of an indigenous capitalist class, and the distortions that can accompany this. And lastly, why do we had this embedding of corruption and state capture? It's also because of opaque systems of party funding that have had a massive corrupting influence, not only on the parties, but on the state and the democratic system as a whole. Now it's subject to debate whether the efforts of the ANC since its conference in 2017 to show up state capacity and improve ethical conduct and legitimacy will bear fruit. On the one side is the challenge of state organs that were hollowed out and do not have capacity. On the other is the fact that corruption had become so entrenched that resistance to corrective efforts may overwhelm the polity. And so to conclude, this study argues that the thesis of South African exceptionalism cannot be sustained. There are many areas where South Africa performs better than its peers, despite being a latecomer into the democratic game. Civil liberty, separation of powers, self-assertion of the judiciary, legitimacy of electoral institutions, the social wage, and so on. Civil society is also vibrant. But in terms of post-colonial elite class formation, South Africa is not so much different from the three case studies. Political power has been used to advance the interests of the post-colonial political elite, affecting the depth of socio-economic transformation. What complicates matters in South Africa is that the erstwhile colonial metropolis in terms of the white community and its colonial inheritance, coexists in one country with the formerly colonized. Whereas in the 3 case studies, the colonial settlers, in inverted commas, decided to leave after independence. In South Africa, while there's been some progress with social transformation, structural inequalities are still stubbornly in place. And on such issues as inherited property relations, skills, income distribution, and social capital, South Africa lags behind Algeria and India. This is a trigger for much social anomie. And if the current accumulation trends persist, the possibility of democratic deconsolidation in South Africa cannot be completely ruled out. Mozambique and Algeria do show that periods of unguided drift without decisive movement towards consolidation or deconsolidation can persist over many years, and the insidious impact of reversal would then only be appreciated much later. India demonstrates that a liberal democracy with limited social justice can lead to the emergence of a populism that is based on identity politics, premised on such factors as the caste system, ethnicity, and religion. In a diverse society, this can result into regional and sectoral electoral machines, opening politics to massive corruption in pursuit of pork-barreled interests. In my view, the recent Constitutional Court judgment on the electoral system in South Africa needs to be interrogated also from this perspective of India's political experience. What is being celebrated as the rise of accountability could in fact usher in a fractured, personality-driven, ethnic, corrupt, and eccentric politics that could result in democratic deconsolidation in South Africa. Let me stop here, and we can take up all these issues during discussion, and I do hope I've provoked you to participate actively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel, for that intervention, very incisive. And the last statement that we have intimated, indeed, I'm sure is going to provoke a lot of responses on the judiciary, the court case and elections. I think you nailed it when you spoke about the effects of uneven development, uneven access to resources, uneven access to opportunities, economic and otherwise, and uneven access to power holders as creating fertile ground for toxic tendencies, narrow nationalisms, and all forms of chauvinisms. So this is something that indeed post-colonial governments need to avoid, this uneven development. Can I just remind everyone that please use the chat platform to share your comments and to raise any questions that you have, and then we are going to read them out to the presenters later on. But for now, let me move on to the respondents, and let me start with Xolelwa. Quickly, Xolelwa is the Director of Project Management at MISTRA. She studied towards a BSc degree at the University of Cape Town, where she majored in archaeology. After graduating, she went on to complete a BSc Honours degree in Physical Anthropology at the University of Pretoria. In 2010, she was awarded a fellowship by the Archives and Public Cultures Research Initiative to complete her MPhil in Heritage and Public Culture at the University of Cape Town Centre for African Studies. She is passionate about critical engagement with knowledge production within African contexts. Xolelwa is an honorary research associate at the University of Cape Town and is also a member of the South African History Online Board of Directors. Ha, Xolelwa, you are in the SAHO Board of Directors. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Zenzo, for that introduction. And thank you, colleagues, for joining us today to discuss yet another product of MISTRA's research. Now, I'm occupying a very tricky position as a respondent, as an insider at MISTRA, because I'm one of the directors at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, and also became familiar with the process of the making of this particular report. So my position as a respondent is more of a self-reflection, and I felt that in my response, it is important to actually try and also unpack the methodology, the approach, and also how we theorized about democracy in this report. So in a way, it's a self-critique, but also a reflection at the same time. Now, starting with methodology, I mean, as those who are familiar with the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, is that we pride ourselves in our adoption of the transdisciplinary approach to our research. Now, what is the extent to which this was applied in the making of this report? In my review of the report, I found that to a certain extent, we were honest to that claim of transdisciplinarity. And I say this by looking first at the tools that were utilized. I mean, there's diverse tools. We in terms of our approach, we conducted interviews. There was also workshops, internal and external workshops that we undertook. But we also, in terms of these interviews, for us, we deemed them to be contributions to the body of work. So beyond our researchers at MISTRA, we've engaged with experts who are familiar with these democracies and how they've transitioned. And in addition to that, the inclusion of external contributors, by way of external researchers from VETS, University, and also AMEC, that then expanded, our lens so that it goes beyond the MISTRA lens. So that is true to the idea of us being, diverse in our approach and in how we gather our evidence. The team itself at MISTRA, what I need to emphasize is that if you look at the book and those who've contributed, some of those contributors are part of this meeting, and the diversity is in terms of gender, it's in terms of age, I mean, we included researchers all the way from interns, junior researchers, all the way up to our executive director. And that created a lot of nuance in terms of, the literature engaged with, the type of people we spoke to, and also the debates internally. They became enriched by that diversity, which is a very good approach. And what also was appreciated was the African perspective through the inclusion of critical thinkers such as Mafeje, who's been mentioned a number of times by both our executive director and Zenzo as well. There's also the inclusion of Mamdani as a leading theorist. However, my criticism in terms of that is that as much as these leading African scholars have been included, the extent to which they have been utilized as tools of analysis. I will use Mamdani's case, especially with reference to, citizenship and how post-colonial democracies have issues of ethnicity and tribalism, implied in them in terms of their understanding or how of democracy, or how democracy unfolds in those post-colonial contexts. I believe our team could have done more to amplify that component. I know Joel, when he presented, he mentions, issues of ethnicity, and in particular in terms of the Indian case, but I believe the team could have done a bit more to amplify, in particular, African perspectives in terms of our claim to transdisciplinarity. Now, coming to interviews, when you look at the interviews that we conducted in the book, I mean, there's also diversity there. There's academics, there's those who were part of the liberation struggle, and there's those who've also been part of these new democratic dispensations, that's in terms of being part of the government, or the state rather. In the South African context, I mean, my criticism, and my colleagues are aware of this, that there was always this bias towards the ANC. And I know that the response to that would be that what we're focusing on is those liberation movements who then became the ruling parties. But I believe we could have done a bit more in terms of including other liberation movements that were there, during the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. Now, in the case studies, what is positive about the usage of Algeria and also India is that it allows us to stretch our minds in terms of really understanding this notion of whether South Africa is exceptional or not. And I believe there was a lot to learn there, especially when it comes to the military culture there, which is something that, in particular in Algeria, which is something that might be, seem a bit foreign for South Africans in terms of our trajectory, but there was use in that. However, we could have done more again, but I suppose this is something that the Open Society, I'm sorry to put you in the spotlight, Bulelwa, maybe had resources been available, we could have gone beyond those case studies. I mean, I would imagine that we could learn a bit more from Nigeria and also Zimbabwe. And this is informed by, in terms of Zimbabwe, the proximity geographically, but also both these two countries that I suggest, in terms of them being part of Anglophone Africa, then there could have been more parallels using that lens of a post-colonial or post-Anglo colonial African country. Now, what is the impact of this limitation of not using Mamdane's theory on post-colonial democracy? What I've found in reading the text is that in engaging with citizenship or active citizenry, we find that there is a weakness, because I think we could have found more nuance in terms of how these nations are formed. Because part of nation formation, you cannot get away from issues of identity and the tribing effect of colonialism. Because a lot of these tribes and groups and categories that we're holding on to in the present were actually the making of colonialism. And I think that's something, that's a gap there that can also be, attended to if we were to maybe go into the next phase of this. So my recommendation would be maybe expand the case studies to include Nigeria and or Zimbabwe, but also, take seriously, these theories on post-colonial democracy, in particular, the inclusion of issues of identity, the tribing effect of colonialism, and the need to then untribe that. In terms of the unpacking of whether, the South African situation is exceptional, and I think all agree that South Africa is not exceptional, and that is on the basis of how the democracy was actually experienced in South Africa. And I agree with the ED that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from India. But I think one of the things we need to be honest about is that some of these parallels are informed by the fact that India was also an elite-driven transition, and we need to spell it out, and we cannot hide behind that, pretending that this was more of a grassroots movement when it was elite-driven. And Zenzo also mentioned the issue of coalitions, that there's a lot to learn there in terms of what happened in India, and there's potential for South Africa to follow, that path. In terms of legitimacy, I found it strange that after, the criticism of, how we still have issues of poverty, inequality, and so on in our country, there's still this argument that we make at the end that there's political legitimacy, but that's only informed by the fact that we have regular elections, but without paying attention to issues of like a professional public service. Can we honestly say we've got a legitimate state when public service is not professional? Active citizenship is still a problem, wherein we find that where citizens become active or they rise up, it's more of a reaction to a particular or specific issue, like gender-based violence, or I'd use the example of the TAC in response to HIV and so on. However, you don't see that mass movement of that or that heritage of mass democratic movement. And also what I'm missing is the new activisms, which is something that we could have learned from the countries that I mentioned, Zimbabwe and Nigeria, the current or the latest protests that we've been seeing. And I think there's potential there. And if we were to continue with this work, it would be worth our while to unpack youth participation, how that has been marginalized and also neutralized. I mean, the case in point being the Fallist movement. But for me, the biggest elephant in the room is the tribe, as mentioned. And I think Mamdani can offer us a tool of analysis there. What do you do with the tribe that we so uphold, whereas we know that the tribing notion was a colonial effect? I will leave it there. Thank you very much, Zenzo, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for that self-reflective criticism. And, I'm particularly excited because what it then means is that the reviewing of this report post its launch has already started, and this is what we have done. And it's also so interesting that you applaud us to bring in more other countries to be part of this conversation in terms of learning from them. And you mentioned Zimbabwe, a very interesting example indeed, and I would say probably even a lot of negative lessons that we can learn from Zimbabwe. Let me move on to Judge Albie Sachs. Judge Albie, quickly, just to give those who may not know a bit of his background, Albie Sachs is an activist and a former judge on the Constitutional Court of South Africa from 1994 up to 2009. He began practicing as an advocate at the Cape Bar at the age of 21, defending people charged under the racial statutes and security laws of apartheid. After being arrested and placed in solitary confinement for over 5 years, Sachs went into exile in England, where he completed a PhD at Sussex University. In 1988, he lost his right arm and his sight in one eye when a bomb was placed in his car in Maputo, where he was mostly active within this liberation movement. After the bombing, he devoted himself to the preparations for a new democratic constitution for South Africa. When he returned home from exile, he served as a member of the Constitutional Committee and the National Executive of the African National Congress. He is an author of several books. I can't read all of them, but his latest book is Oliver Tambo's Dream. Judge Albie, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. You indeed provide a lot of inspiration, and we thank you very much for doing so and for sharing the information that you have. Thank you so much, Judge. You can take over.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be participating, to feel the energy, the excitement, the provocation. And I'm still remembering the tribe, and Samora Machel saying, for the nation to live, the tribe must die. And it sounded so powerful, and he was right and he was wrong. He was right that tribalism, ethnicity, mobilization on the basis of ethnicity must die. But the tribe, in the sense of the language, the culture, the sentiments, the emotions of the people expressing themselves so particularly in different parts of the country, didn't only not have to die, it had to flourish. And I'm going to begin my presentation with the references to Mozambique in this very, very fascinating book that I do hope leads to lots of follow-ups. Mozambique is presented as really a country that in the liberation struggle, achieving power, adopting one-party state, trying socialism that failed, going over to mixed economy, multi-partisan, and producing a measure of economic growth, but the inequalities are bigger than they ever were. The corruption is very great. And I want to challenge what I regard as an oversimplified but understandable presentation in terms of the democracy there. It was more profound than that. It was an attempt to have people's democracy. We spoke about the revolution. Frelimo was enormously popular, and Samora Machel was a brilliant leader. He was singing, he was speaking, he was communicating revolutionary ideas to the people in ways that they could understand. He was decolonizing politics and political discourse in a very profound way by his manner and style of work. And all of us who went there to help build the revolution were inspired by the energy in that country. And it couldn't be sustained. It wasn't simply a socialist experiment that failed. And I'm quoted in support of something that to justify that statement. It could have failed, and it could have recovered from that failure. It didn't recover from the failure because of the Cold War, because of anti-communism, because of the way South Africa, Rhodesia were able to mobilize international support to put a squeeze on Mozambique. Samora Machel was killed when his plane was brought down. The harbors were starved of shipping. The railway didn't bring any goods in. The country was throttled. It was a total onslaught against Mozambique that included physical destruction and the civil war. Inside Mozambique at the time, we used to say, why are we struggling so much to develop the country? There are three reasons. It's the colonial heritage, it's the enemy action, it's our mistakes. And different weighting was given to these different elements. And the people who put everything on enemy action wouldn't correct the mistakes that were being made. The people who only put emphasis on the mistakes gave no weight to the impact of the throttling of Mozambique. And I say this as somebody, I was blown up in Mozambique. I didn't die, Mozambican died. That country paid so much blood for our liberation in South Africa that we have to, when we counteract xenophobia, understand the role that Africa played in our transformation. We're not being gracious, we're not being generous. We are recording a fact that those countries paid an enormous price for our freedom. We owe them, and we owe them enormously. But we owe them more than that. We learned so much from Mozambique, positive and negative. We learned about the importance of pluralism. I was converted from believing in revolutionary power, people's power, maybe that's the way to go forward. Cuba and Nicaragua, Mozambique, Angola, we were inspired by that idea of one party wasn't just particular people with particular interests. It was the workers, the peasants, revolutionary intellectuals coming together, fighting racism, fighting regionalism, fighting tribalism to unify the country against imperialism. We were inspired by that. And initially it seemed to be working. And we discovered if you don't have space for opposition, which is of great importance to the open society, it doesn't go away. It gets picked up in the Cold War. It gets picked up in counter-revolution, and the country was destroyed, with millions of refugees fleeing the country, with tens of thousands of people I lost an arm, people without legs because of the mines. And when I came back to South Africa in 1990, and people said, Comrade Albie, we were preparing for the revolution, and now you're coming from outside and you're saying we must negotiate. I had to think about Mozambique and what Mozambique went through, the crucifixion, if you like, of Mozambique, as part and parcel of our liberation in South Africa. And we had to avoid that, and if we could avoid that, it wasn't simply it would be another 10, 20 years of fighting, and neither side was strong enough to beat the other. It was that we had to have space for opposition. We had to have a unity and diversity, which Mozambique was very strong in promoting, but also it was a better way to go. I moved to the Algerian experience. In 1961, I think I was asked by Ruth First to prepare a paper for Fighting Talk, a magazine, on Algeria. And the information was horrific. Hundreds of thousands of Algerians died. Villages were bombed. Torture was used massively. And there was terrorism on the part of the Mozambican freedom fighters. A country, the soul of that country was almost destroyed by the bitterness of the struggle and of the fighting. And people from Algeria were telling us, from it Albie they would say, things went badly wrong when the military took over in our country. We didn't not only not get the freedoms we wanted, we could have had a great Mediterranean state that could have involved the people of French origin as Algerians, accepting majority rule, an Arab Muslim country, but being part and parcel of creating a whole nation with unity and diversity. We lost that with a totally top-down state, very militaristic, not having the potential to flourish as a great North African state in the way it could have happened. But we wanted to avoid the cataclysm, the terror, the violence, the destruction of Algeria, from which they haven't fully recovered until this day, and we certainly wanted to avoid military rule. In the case of India, again, I found the description of Nehru as simply being conservative. I felt that was inadequate. It wasn't just an elite transition in India. I must challenge that. The Constituent Assembly was the foundation of drafting their constitution. And it had hundreds of people from all walks of life. It was headed by Ambedkar, who was from the Dalit community himself. And it was a very important foundation for our constitutional process to have our own constitutional assembly drafting our constitution. We learned a lot from India. We learned a lot from the Indian Electoral Commission who came to South Africa with certain traditions of maintaining parliamentary democracy in a very diverse society with the importance of institutions. And our IEC, by and large, has done well. If it comes to the question of exceptionalism in South Africa, I think we are exceptional in one area, but it's a very important area. We're exceptional in terms of our constitution, its content. We're exceptional in terms of the way certain elements of the constitution are working, constitutional democracy. It's not just formal democracy. Our elections are real, they are meaningful, and we get presidents to step down. Our presidents don't step down when 1 million people go into the streets or when tanks go into the streets. Our presidents step down when their own party says, enough already, we want you to leave. And they'll say that if they know that there are going to be elections and the party will lose, the party then recalls the presidents. Now, these are enormous achievements anywhere in the world. They're particularly important in South Africa. I think we must be proud of that. I speak as an unabashedly proud former judge. I think our judiciary has been exceptional. It continues to be exceptional. We have great journalists and we have strong civil society. So all these elements are exceptional. The openness, the vitality of South Africa is wonderful. The openness of our debate is great. The fact that we have a relatively weak and insignificant army, I'm using insignificant in terms of controlling politics, I think is a great gain. It's an achievement on our part. They've done wonderful work in Africa, but they so far have kept out of politics. We just take that for granted. We just take it for granted. It's been an achievement and a work for achievement. Similarly, getting control of the security forces has been extremely important in the transformations in the recent period. However, in terms of the socio-economic transformations, again, it's a mixed area. We have the millions of homes, they're not wonderful homes, but something like 25% of our population have moved from shacks into homes with electricity, water, sewage, and some degree of physical security. It's not enough, the homes aren't good enough. We have a great shortage of land, we have spatial apartheid in the cities, we have enormous problems of access to land for agriculture and so on. But that has been a meaningful transformation. We have something like a third of our population receive social jobs. And that's done partly because you don't get votes unless you do that, but that's part of democracy. So that's all been positive. We have a very large African middle class. It's not wealthy, it's not rich, it doesn't have great assets, but it's moved from poverty to a different station. But all of these achievements have highlighted the inadequacies, the poverty, the inequalities, the spatial apartheid. They've highlighted it. So what's exceptional then in our country is the entrenchment of our democracy that's very, very real and very vibrant and very meaningful. That is exceptional, and I think we should all take pride in that. But what's exceptional is so many people have been left behind, and the success of our democratic project highlights the failure of our social democratic project. It's not enough. So it's the new students coming to the university, and I'll end with this point made by Kumla Madikizela, that wonderful wave of students who held up the banner of decolonization and transformation and change. They discovered inequality through coming to the university. The doors of learning were opened. They came there and they discovered inequality in the university, in the conceptualization of the university, in the access to the resources for studying, for traveling, for enjoying being in the world. They discovered the inequalities there and they raised the flag, the challenge of change. And I think what we need to do then, the answer is not simply to lament the weaknesses and failure of democracy in South Africa, to take pride in the power of democracy in South Africa, to use the mechanisms given to us by our constitution, by the right to vote. And by the way, I agree totally with the points that are being made about the dangers of populism and demagoguery and so on, if we do away with the party system altogether. We must use the instruments that our democracy and our strongly entrenched democracy give us, the freedom of speech, of mobilization, of voting, to get the institutions that we need and strengthen the institutions we need to sustain our democracy. We must use all that to deal with the utterly unacceptable spatial apartheid, inequalities in so many different areas of life, and the lack of access to proper health care, the inequalities in relation to education, inequalities in relation to housing. All of that is completely unsustainable. But we deal with them not by lamentations in terms of our democracy, but by pride in our democracy, to use the instruments of democracy to bring about the changes that we need in our second wave of liberation in South Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Judge Albie. And indeed, you are right. It can't end by lamenting. We need to act, and that's very important. Can I just remind everyone, let's use the chat box to write our comments or to ask questions. Meanwhile, while still waiting for those questions, I have one question here And let me direct this question to Joel and Albie. The ANC assumed power at the back of an uncontested political legitimacy as a party of liberation. One can argue that this hegemony was common in most, if not all, liberation movements that had ascended to power in post-colonial societies. You talk about TANU in Tanzania, Malawi Congress Party, you talk about UNIP in Zambia, you talk about KANU, MPLA, you also talk about ZANU-PF, and Judge Alpe has actually indicated now that even Frelimo was hegemonic at that point. However, what we also note is that between the second and the third decades, these liberation movements get a serious knock on their legitimacy. And there are many reasons for this. Part of it could be sins of incumbency, taking people for granted. And again, also it could be that the relevance of the liberation struggle gets to wane and it loses traction with younger generations who do not live in nostalgia because they did not experience the liberation struggle. So for South Africa, events between Polokwane and I've heard people use this description in describing Polokwane as the crime scene of what South Africa is today. So if you are looking at what happened in Polokwane and what is happening up to now, between Polokwane and now, including the recall of 2 state presidents and the continuous demonstrations against the party by some members of the party, this also probably pointing to some level of degeneration within the liberation movement. Could it be that liberation movements in general, as born out of resistance politics, are failing to transform into democratic parties that can resonate with the multiple intergenerational needs that are common in our modern societies? Could it be explained along those lines? I would then come back to the chat line, but maybe just if you can respond to that question, Joel. Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Did you hear the question though?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yeah, there's been this theory that liberation movements as a rule decline after some 20 years in office or in power. I suppose empirical evidence does demonstrate that that tendency does play itself out. But perhaps what we should look at is what are the factors that lead to that, and is that tendency entirely inevitable? In my view, some of the factors would relate to being in office for a long time, which can result in arrogance and taking people for granted, assuming that they will always support the party of liberation. But secondly, I think the other element is what I refer to in my input as post-colonial class formation, and particularly the emergence of a capitalist class from within the formerly oppressed, and the extent to which the political elite also takes advantage of that. This results in 2 tendencies. The first one is a social distance between the leaders and the led. Once you ascend to political positions, you might come from an informal settlement. By dint of that, you immediately become, in inverted commas, middle class. You are separated from the mass of the people whom you are meant to represent. But the other element that attaches to that process of class formation would also be the corruption that attaches to very legitimate processes of economic empowerment of the formerly marginalized. As we have seen with what is happening in the Zondo Commission and the recent arrests, people do emerge sometimes genuinely wanting to be part of the new bourgeoisie, but because they rely on state institutions, because they are a bureaucratic bourgeoisie, they then find themselves drawn into the vortex of corruption. So ethics also impacts on that. But I would perhaps taking from what Judge Sachs has said about the vibrancy of our democracy, I would want to conclude my response by saying that what happened in Nasrec in 2017 at the ANC's conference and the ANC's current communication about renewal is not merely a consequence of the good hearts of those who might be in leadership, although there might be an element of that. I think it's also because the electorate is capable of punishing those who do not deal with corruption and state capture. And so you can say, because of the strength of and legitimacy of our electoral practices in South Africa now, that presents an instrument that forces self-correction on the part of the politicians. This is how I would read it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Joel. Judge Sachs, let me just read quickly the other comments, and then we can also respond together when we respond to these other comments. So I have a comment and a question from TK Poole. He says, great points always regarding Nechitenze, particularly the matter of the constitution allowing individuals to stand and not use political parties. Does this not open the door for money to more quickly circumvent the political processes as in the United States? Secondly, does the South African case not make made complicated by an uncritical adoption of a constitution that espouses social liberal values over what is common among the population of South Africa? And then the second question is, while welcoming some of the judge's key insights, I would vehemently disagree with him on having a black middle class. If using traditional notions of middle class formation like Webber's, Wu and Blom, etc., what we have is a class that is one paycheck away from poverty. So can we really call them the middle class? That's the question that is asking. And then Tsakiso also raises a very pertinent issue. He says, great presentation, Joel. However, I am worried about the silences of the book around youth participation and faith in the electoral structures when they want to raise their discontent, and this experience is prone in South Africa, in the South African context. The youth is not apolitical. They protest for issues affecting their communities, yet they do not vote. Okay, maybe let's start with Joel now, and then we'll move to, let's start with Judge Albie, and then we'll move to Tolelo and then Joel.
You know, people speak about the legitimacy of the liberation movement as though it's just some kind of vague thing up in the air that you feel nostalgic about and that people like. It was much more intense than that. Every neighborhood in Soweto had somebody who was in the struggle, somebody who'd given up studying, university, crossed the border to come back and fight. Somebody who'd been thrown into prison. It was personal. Some families had 2 or 3 or 4 grandchildren in the struggle. It was personal. They'd grown up fighting. This represented dignity, pride, hope for the future. was very, very intense. If people continue to vote now, I don't think the masses are stupid. They can see the inequalities. They understand the unfairness. But they see that this is like our government, with all the failures of our government and our people, we are struggling to kind of find a way. And they are very forgiving up to a point. And as Joel has pointed out, it's up to a point. And that point is being reached now. We're okay. We've been very forgiving for so many things.
Mm.
You know, you look at the ambivalence about JZ. I remember when I was actually getting an honorary degree in Portugal, and I switched on the TV at night, and he announced that he was resigning. And I felt now as Albie, not Judge, just as Albie. I felt such a sense of relief, delight that the democratic system was working. And I felt such sadness. I'd known him in Mozambique as our chief rep. He worked so hard. He was so good. He was self-taught. He had so many wonderful qualities. And to see how that famous laughter had now become a source of mockery was painful for me. It was painful. So examining all these things, they are painful. The huge achievement of, I'll call it our generation. People said when you get democracy in Africa, everything collapses, it fails. The railways don't run, nothing happens, everything goes to pot. Look what happened in the Congo. And our leaders were very calm and steady. We had to keep jobs, we had to keep things moving. We had to reconstruct all the instruments of government. 16 departments of education had to be one department of education. These are all things we take for granted. It wasn't only getting rid of the apartheid signs, we had to reconstruct the very structures of government, and we achieved that, I think, with marvelous effect. I couldn't see how the armies would come together. We created a single army. So these were enormous achievements. And it's these things that gave legitimacy to the project, to the whole program. It wasn't just the marvelous Mandela and the wonderful words of Tutu and so on. It was seeing real changes, and our country is different from apartheid South Africa, and it's hugely different. I use the term middle class with inverted commas because I accept there's no wealth, there's no security, but it's people not as poor as they were before, and people who are driving the country in many, many ways, and people on whom our future economy depends. So in terms of the transformation of the ANC, if there's going to be another look at, a country you might look at is Mexico, and the PRI, the Mexican Revolutionary Party, that created a country called Mexico with pride and independence. The ANC created South Africa as a country with pride and independence in many, many ways. And why the PRI failed and what lessons we can learn in South Africa because of that. In terms of social and economic rights, there are two themes. Our court, I can speak for the Constitutional Court, never accepted the so-called liberal notion of the right of the individual to get ahead, to own property, and to fend off all competitors, whether it comes from the state or wherever. We always accepted the concept of Ubuntu, which became very important in the thinking. The interdependence of human beings became very important. The challenge to patriarchy became very important in terms of the thinking of the Constitutional Court. Extremely significant. I actually wrote a judgment on gender-based violence, looking to our Constitution, why it had to be denounced and why laws had to be upheld to deal with gender-based violence. So it's been a very progressive utilization of the ideas of fundamental rights. So the failure is not in terms of the constitutional values or even in terms of the concept of rights. The failure has been to extend the notion of rights and fundamental rights more profoundly and to get the integrity that's required And let me end with this about power. When I gave an inaugural lecture at UCT, I was Professor Extraordinary at UWC. I had one foot in one camp, and Honorary Professor at UCT, another foot in another camp. And they are two different camps, two different universities, different personalities, trajectories, and so on. In any event, I'm speaking at UCT, and I opened my lecture by saying the beautiful ones are not yet born. And I'm quoting a Nigerian writer picked up in Zimbabwe. I didn't say now we're going to get change, everything is wonderful. The constitutions are based on the tension between corruptibility and perfectibility. And we have to guard against corruption, which we've seen inside our own organization, we've seen elsewhere in Africa. And I also quoted Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who said, "A rich man's fart smells sweet." And this was in 1992. It's preparing for the change. And power does something to people. And in a way, you can never tell in advance what happens to people when they're in power. And some of our people managed power wonderfully and well and didn't change. I'm going to throw out a bouquet now to Peter Mayabuye, also known as Joel Mitchizenzi. He hasn't changed. He's mixed with, they say, people mixed with kings and lose the Republican touch. He's mixed with presidents, and he hasn't lost the people's touch. He never got seized by power, but he worked with people who've been in the struggle with him, and the opportunities of power, they had no immunization against it, no immunization against the temptations, and the power of the market. The market is amorphous. The market doesn't have values. The market's not honest. There's no integrity in the market. And the market gives opportunities to people in government and people in the private sector in ways that there was no resistance to that. And we have to find the antidotes, find the vaccines, if you like. Again, it's not just enough to appeal to morality. It's not just enough to send crooks to jail. You have to find the vaccines, the institutional vaccines, and the antibodies to prevent these things from decimating our country.
Okay, thank you very much, Judge. I'll be Kolelwa.
Thank you, Zenzo, and thank you, colleagues. I think I will respond. I'll try and combine my response to deal with both the middle class and the youth. And I will deliberately say it's the Black middle class that I'm assuming that we're speaking to here. And the reason why I'm treating those as, a combined cohort is that I believe that this is the most precarious, subgroup or demographic in South Africa. And I know that we argue in the book that as long as we still have legitimacy in terms of, regular, free and fair elections, we must not take for granted that these groupings are not a potential internal threat. I will say this because there's been a lot of noise coming up in terms of, questioning the transition. And in the book, we do admit that during the transition, in particular the CODESA moment, there was this notion of compromise wherein incentives had to be put forward as a way of ensuring a smooth transition. And in that process, the idea of nationalizing, key resources was abandoned. But also there was this idea of repurposing institutions, key institutions. But what you found is that in that process, the new ruling party would then come in as new occupants of these institutions that were already flawed without transforming them. Fine, the exception there would be the making of the new institutions through the Chapter 9 institutions that came as a part of the constitutionalism. But now, when you look at these groups that I'm talking about, the Black middle class and young people, are the ones who are questioning that moment. They are questioning the compromise. And to an extent where in the present, that is being regarded to as the moment of selling out. And that's why I'm saying we need to also be honest with some of these things. And this is also alongside the idea of, this transition being elite driven. Now, when it comes to youth, I think it would be actually quite sad if we were to ignore the new activisms. And I think one of the reasons why we're struggling with these is because we cannot wrap our heads around them. I mean, first of all, just in terms of how things are done, platforms of engagement, leadership, structures, because you would find that in most instances, it's these movements or these new activisms are led by young, queer women, which is something that I think older generations or those generations that were part of that transition are struggling to engage with. So I think there's the need to open up to new forms of engagement and allow ourselves to pass the baton effectively. Because now what you're seeing is that in terms of these youthful new movements is that you find these ruptures, and you can say it's mainly because they're not as organized. But I think again, within that cohort, that combined with the Black middle class, there is a potential for a popular movement, and if not directed, could have strong nationalist and and it can nationalist potential, but also can be violent, and we cannot keep sweeping those under the carpet. And if you observe the Fallist movement, I mean, there's so many efforts to neutralize, to marginalize, and actually just not hear what the young people were saying. And I think there's an opportunity there, because what they're raising brings us back to this idea of theorizing about democracies in an African context. Maybe the reason why young people are unable to articulate these things is because there was no proper transmission of the tools of engagement or passing on of that baton. So there needs to be a serious engagement with those groupings to actually understand ways of engaging with democracy in the present. And I believe this crisis, the COVID crisis, is actually offering us an opportunity to unpack or deconstruct democracy as we know it, because it has been revealed through the pandemic that there's actually limitations to democracies. I mean, we've seen like the countries that are supposed to be the leaders of democracy, the most democratic, or so to speak, country is the one that's leading in terms of infections, So, and also you look at how the virus has been contained, all these issues where people are raising, fundamental principles of what we know as democracy. And at the same time, how those then limit the ways in which those governments contain, the spread of the virus. So there needs to be a new conversation, and there needs to be a serious consideration of the Black middle class and the young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xolelwa. Joel, if you may allow me, let me ask the last round of questions, and then I'll allow all the speakers to respond as they also offer their closing remarks. And that will also include you, Bulelwa, in whatever remarks you may have as we close. So I have a question from Ambassador Perry Gilda, and he says, Joel has spoken about the hangover of South Africa's colonial history for South Africa. To what extent did the research look at the ongoing influence of the former colonial powers? He's talking about the imperialists and the new imperialists. So you're talking about France over Algeria, Britain over India as well as in South Africa. So he says, how much of an influence do they still hold in these countries, including Mozambique? And then there's a question from Anthony. He says, on case selection, why Algeria, why India, and why Mozambique? Does question of whether South Africa is exceptional depend on who you are comparing with? Higher levels of economic development mean ANC is not a typical liberation movement. Massive business power and much greater union and civil society influence, but compare to dominant parties globally, and many similar patterns emerge, especially use of the state and parastatals to secure continued electoral dominance. And maybe a last question for me, very short and quick, would be to say, if we look at the behavior of some of the people that liberated us in these countries, is it not something that we should have anticipated at independence or when we gained freedom? And if indeed we're supposed to anticipate that at that moment, why is it that we seem ill-prepared to deal with what is happening at the moment? I will start with Joel.
Thank you. I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Thank you.
The issue about the electoral system, I did make my point in the presentation that I do have a concern that if not properly managed, we might end up with a new electoral system in which you have fractured politics that does not unite the nation, but leads to further divisions within society in terms of regionalism, in terms of personality-centered campaigns, in terms of ethnicity, and so on and so forth. And this, as we have seen in polities like the United States, leads to pork-barreled politics, where people merely concentrate on their constituency and would want resources to be transferred there. And it also leads to battles around gerrymandering and so on. The question that I have in my mind is, yes, people are celebrating this, that it might introduce something new, but how will the new politicians differ from the old ones? It's not quite clear in my own mind. And further to this would be, in a diverse society like ours, we might start experiencing the same tendencies that are there in India. On the issue of youth participation, I would agree with Xolelwa. One of the striking concerns from the 2019 elections was that there was a 40% decline in registration amongst 18 to 19-year-olds. This needs further interrogation. Some argue that this is because there was no registration weekend, I think, in January before the elections, or there were fewer registration weekends. Otherwise, overall, in terms of participation, this tendency does manifest itself across the globe. Young people participate less than the older ones, and the theory that some use is that as people become more responsible, have more responsibilities in families, have their own houses and start to participate in paying rates and so on, they then become more active in politics. We might be experiencing the same thing, but we also need to differentiate, as Xolelwa was saying, between party political participation and electoral participation on the one hand, and social activism using a variety of platforms. It could be Fismat's Fall, it could be social media, it could even be community protests, the so-called social or service delivery protests. In fact, what we forget to say when we look at those so-called social or service delivery protests, is that the most active participants there are young people. Influence of former colonial powers, the question from Barry. Yes, there are studies that have been done about this, what some have referred to as a path dependency from the colonial metropolis. That path dependency would manifest itself in the form, amongst others, of the kind of bureaucracy that you have inherited and how you structure the new bureaucracy as you go forward. It would manifest itself in relation to how you handle matters of the judiciary, how the judges are chosen, and so on and so on and so forth. It might be the detailed matters related to parliaments and conduct of the speakers and debates and other things. But even more critically, that path dependency would relate to the economic relations that were forged under colonialism and which continue in one form or another in the post-colonial milieu, in terms of exports and imports, in terms of the kind of companies that operate in the post-colonial society and so on. And so there are many manifestations of path dependency that need to be looked at. And we need to ask ourselves the question, which are the good elements that need to continue and which are the bad ones that we need to get rid of? Why the case studies, and could we have chosen others and so on? Yes, I think with regard to case studies, there can always be a critique. Xolelwa has posed the question, should we have looked at Nigeria and Zimbabwe, and should we have further studies that look at that? And some may argue, as the question seemed to suggest, that South Africa is more of a developed economy, but perhaps that is subject to debate because South Africa is essentially, in inverted commas, a third and first world in one, two economies, as former President Thabo Mbeki used to say. And so you would find in South Africa many elements of what you find in India and Mozambique, but also many elements of what you find in the US and the UK. And that creates its own unique tendencies. So when South Africa looks at case studies, yes, we need to look at developed economies, but we also need to look at the underdeveloped ones because that manifests in our own society. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joel. Joel has almost answered all the questions. So let's move on to Judge Albi, your closing remarks, and briefly so, and then we'll move to Xolelwa and then Bulelwa last. Judge Albi, you need to unmute your mic.
Hello, everybody. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to make 2 points. The one is about the continuing bureaucracy, and the other is about electoral system. The Mozambican bureaucracy from the colonial time, inherited by Frelimo, had been created by a kind of colonial fascist dictatorship in Portugal. And it was astonishingly bureaucratic. When I went to the language school, normally you would learn, can you show me the way to the railway station in Portuguese? Or where is the nearest bank? Or where is there a toilet? I learned about how can we destroy the apparatus of state? Espangalhar o aparelho do Estado. Fancy, long political words. Destroying the colonial, racist, capitalist apparatus of state was seen to be a fundamental feature. We couldn't inherit the state, which was created to maintain colonial exploitation. We had to destroy the colonial state and create a new state answering to the people. And yet the habits of bureaucracy that were so intense were taken over completely. The incumbents were different, completely different. But the habits were so terrible that people would go crazy with frustration. And the number of forms you had to fill in that had nothing to do with the Mozambican revolution. You had to fill in countless forms for anything that you wanted. And the people were complaining about the bureaucracy. And the answer of the government was to say, we take the campaign against bureaucracy very, very carefully, and every ministry must have a book, must have a kiosk at the ground floor where people can make their complaints, and they have to make their complaints in 4 copies to make your complaints. They couldn't even, the complaints against bureaucracy had to be in 4 copies in a bureaucratic form, and we all just kind of laughed. When I wanted to make, after I was blown up, I wanted my art collection. I collected a lot of sculpture and paintings and so on, marvelous work from Mozambique. Right during the war, we had more artists earning a living in Mozambique than could earn a living in South Africa. It was part of creating the new Mozambican personality. I was blown up, I had to leave. I had to decide where does my artwork go, and I said University of the Western Cape. That's where I want my artwork to go, the People's University. 2 years passed, it couldn't get through the customs in Mozambique. I got back. The South African Revolution was faster than the Mozambican customs. I got back before my artwork. So it's amazing how certain features of the colonial style of mentality are maintained. And I should imagine we're not exempt from that in South Africa. Features of the apartheid system. Even though the incumbents are different, some of the mentality, the styles of work, the automatic attitudes retained from the past. And we have to deal with that. When we built our new constitutional court, we decided we're going to build a court that's not a copy of the old colonial courts. We didn't use the term decolonized, but our court is very much a decolonized building. The structure, the artwork, the light, the openness, the style of work of the judges, this was a new institution, was different. The warmth, the intimacy, the informality. I like being called Judge Albie, not my lordship. We dropped all of that. But we had to take specific steps consciously to create a new kind of ambience. In terms of the electoral system, the ANC didn't have a policy which we brought from Lusaka about the electoral system in South Africa. We had a policy to have a non-racial democracy against group rights, against 3 presidents representing different groups and power sharing. But on things like the electoral system, we were completely open. And we had a workshop, dear Stellenbosch, and we had all sorts of different prototypes. And we all ended up supporting, for the first elections, proportional representation. It did not favor the ANC. If we had carried on with constituencies, that would have favored the ANC. With 60% of the votes, we would have got 80% of the seats. It would have been a disaster. We wanted everybody to be at the Constitutional Assembly. We didn't want anybody to say this is not our constitution. We didn't have a hand in making it an ANC constitution. Proportional representation was the way to go. And then we had it at national level and provincial level. But we said, and the but has been forgotten, we said the next elections should be like the German system, the mixed system, a mix of constituency and proportional representation. Constituencies to get direct contact between the electors and the elected, and PR to ensure that the number of seats in Parliament represented the will of the people. It also made it easier for women to be nominated. It made it easier for people who are not good at tap thumping and speaking out and not strong local leaders, but people who have a lot to contribute in terms of thoughtfulness to get onto the lists. And then it all depended on the democracy in the political organizations as to how the lists were chosen. My own view is that we should look again at the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission's report, which is a majority report with a number of ANC people on it. in terms of the electoral system, which would be to have fairly large constituencies with the choice inside those areas to choose the people you want. It could get the best of both the PR system and also the fact that we didn't want complicated electoral systems that illiterate people wouldn't be able to handle. The PR system lists the photograph of the leader was something very, very easily to do. But I would favor adopting what was the majority report of the Van Zyl Schabbat Commission, which was set up by the ANC government. It wasn't some kind of think tank from a conservative point of view that was established. I think that's the way to go. And just congratulations to MISTRA for getting this thing going and having that lively, open kind of debate. And congratulations also to the Open Society for promoting this kind of activity. And I think we need more, not only intergenerational activity, but civil society activities of shared interest, which gets shared points of view, shared forms of finance, and like a unity and diversity in terms of intellectual thinking.
Thank you so much, Judge Albi.
Zenzo, before Xolelwa,
yes,
with apologies, I just saw a note from Barry that his question had not been fully responded to. And I seem now to understand it, amongst others, to raise the question of geopolitics and the attempts on the part of former colonizers to influence what happens in the states that are liberated. I wouldn't want to go into detail responding to it, except to say that with regard to Africa, there is a book that MISTRA published, which is on geopolitics and the place of Africa in that, and that issue is comprehensively canvassed in the book. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joel. Yes, Xolelwa, briefly, and then Bulelo.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for such a vibrant conversation. In closing, I think we need to have a more nuanced approach to post-coloniality. I mean, we refer to these societies as post-colonial societies, and are they truly post-colonial? Because I believe that that notion of post-coloniality when it comes to these countries is very flawed. As long as we still have systems, that were left behind by the colonizer, we still have institutions that have been occupied by these former liberation movements. The culture, the language is largely influenced by the colonial power. And I suppose this also lends itself to Barry's question about the hangover from the colonizer. In my view, I would link it to my entry point about the tribing effect, that we cannot take away from the fact that that was a colonial moment when there was a scramble for Africa and lines were drawn across the continent, splitting families, splitting groups, and forming new categories within those borders. And the fact that those persist in the present, for me, is evidence of the colonial impact that is still present with us today. So can we really refer to ourselves as being post-colonial? And for me, the evidence for the lack of this transition is in these youthful movements where they talk about decolonizing. Because if we were fully post-colonial, there would not be modern or new activisms calling for a decolonized Africa. So I will leave you with, I think also Judge Sachs also spoke about Samora Machel, his notion of how the tribe needs to die for the nation to rise. And it was extended by Gracia Machel in one of our annual lectures where she spoke to how these nations again that we're holding on so strongly to, which are informed by these colonial borders that were so abstract, can also, maybe can lend themselves to that idea of dying so that the continent can rise. So I think I will leave it there. So I think I don't quite buy into this idea that we've reached post-coloniality. Thank you, Zenzo, and thank you, everyone. And thank you, OSISA, Open Society Foundation, for giving us this opportunity. And we trust that we will be able to carry on with the work post this launch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Polelo. And Bulelwa, your closing remarks.
Yeah, Xolelwa, it's always quite nice to hear a very direct request like that. So we'll take that under advisement. Colleagues, it's been a really fantastic conversation and an exciting and invigorating conversation. I can't imagine how exciting it would be if we were able to actually be in the same room together. And as we are breaking bread, we're able to take some of these conversations into sidebar conversation and also have a multidisciplinary debate, especially the young people, young voices, to be part of the conversation, largely speaking. There's always a saying that says, not the quantity of the leadership that you've got, is it the quality of leadership? And that has never been more important in Africa as a continent, but more important in South Africa, particularly at this time. I mean, if you doubt that, just have a look at the 200-year-old democracy in the US, which has been shaken to a shadow of itself within 4 years, just because of weak leadership at the top. And so that's something for me that really strikes a very strong chord. We know our democracy is in recession. We know that there is a youth, a large part of our society, a younger part of our society who hasn't bought in for whatever reason. It's about us now taking the action to make sure that things happen, that we activate them, we engage them, we're able to understand them, and we bring them to the table in terms of conversation. So youth participation in ensuring that the democracy that we really fought for is alive and vibrant and resilient is incredibly important to us as open society. I was laughing when Joel was talking about old politicians and what new politicians will look like, because I have seen the average age of the parliamentarian currently in parliament and the parliamentarians currently in parliament. And you just have to ask yourself, are we growing the new energy? And how are we nurturing them to be able to take those positions with responsibility, with pride and sacrifice, as others have done before them? Because that's what is needed. It's a calling, really. It's not about just your generating income. It's about being able to do things for people that you really care about, that you care about your country. And we want to see that energy. And I have to say, we've seen that energy. We just haven't harnessed it yet. And we need to put in place actions on how to harness that energy, nurture it, make sure that it matures, so that we leave the country, we leave as we exit as the elder generation, the new energy comes in such a focused way. I can commit from the Open Society side that we have 4 very major roles that we play as Open Society. We're a grant maker, yes, of course, that's our main role, but we're also a convener. We do advocacy as well as research. And so this conversation, you can be assured that we will take it forward and we will make it live. This document needs to be a living document. But in addition to that, we're very pragmatic. We need to see action on the ground, and we have to figure out, therefore, how do we take this conversation and distill it into actionable strategies that we can then start deploying with grantees on the ground. As I said, this MISTRA report forms a basis of our strategy, and we've taken it very seriously in that. If there's further research that needs to be done, we'll have a look at that, because we do believe that research actually is the oxygen that we need as we move forward in terms of being able to have a collective accelerated impact of implementation during these next 4 years. So Zenzo, I can see the anxiety on your face because the session is overrun. Unfortunately, that's what happens when the session is interesting. And so I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much, Bulelwa. And maybe just quickly to remind attendants, remember I said the objective is also to engender debate on democracy in South Africa. And we can only do that by reading and critiquing this report, raising issues and maybe writing even further. Bulelwa has indicated that this is a living document. Let's make sure that it lives. Again, we were recording this session. We'll try to share the recording with people that RSVP'd, and hopefully that is going to be soon. But quickly, let me take this opportunity now. We have come to the end of this webinar. I would like to thank deeply all participants who shared their time with us. We really are indebted to your presence. I would also like to thank most profoundly the speakers. That's Judge Albie. Thank you so much, Joel. As always, thank you so much, Bulelwa. Thank you so much, and thank you for your commitment towards knowledge sharing and knowledge development. See you next time. Bye.